Welcome to Unscripted. Today we have Nick Martin with us, who is the founder of Mission Plus, which is a digital innovation studio that ideates, builds, and launches digital businesses. So we'll talk about your company and what you do.
Yeah.
But before that, would love to hear about your personal history.
Sure.
Where you're from, what did you do in your life, how did you get here, what are you doing today? Take us on a journey. Let's start from when you were born and where you were born.
I'd love to talk about it. It's actually because it's interesting because a lot of times I used to ask that question when I was working for an investor in the last few years, and his interest was in those same questions, and if I asked people to tell me about themselves, I'd just go straight into their resume. You know, I went to school here and I graduated and this was my first job.
Right.
But realistically, I think there's more to be told, more truth to uncover, like you said, from those stories, going all the way back to when you start.
Yeah.
So for me, that was actually in a small town of 2,000 people in Australia, quite remote part, but close to the beaches like everything is generally in Australia. My parents, though, they immigrated to Australia from different parts of the world. My mum was from the UK, my dad was from India, and they'd met in England in the 60s, 70s, when my dad was studying to be a surgeon and my mum was a nurse, and got married. And then they travelled between and had my three brothers in England, in India, and ultimately Papua New Guinea before they moved to Australia, and then I was born.
Wait, so your parents, so your dad is from India. He immigrated to the UK.
Yeah, that's right.
And your mom is?
She was born in Wales and then she was raised in England.
So they met at a hospital? Same hospital?
In a hospital, yeah.
Oh wow, okay, that's awesome.
One of those stories.
And then they had children. So they had children in the UK, New Guinea,
and in India.
And in India.
Yeah.
How did that? And then you were born in Australia.
Yeah, so I think once they got married and they were living in the UK, it was a place where ultimately they felt that they wanted to move away from. But before they made decisions around where they wanted to go, that they went back to India for a few years, back to the UK. I think there was a few stories of travel. A decision at that point was, do we go to somewhere like the United States or Australia to have that better life that you sometimes hear about? But in the terms of the stepping stones that got them to Australia, it was working for the Australian government in Papua New Guinea before it gained independence. My dad was a medical officer there.
So how did your dad end up from India to the UK? Was he studying?
Oh yes, he'd become a doctor in India and he got some scholarship to become a surgeon in the UK. So he went abroad for further study.
Right. And your dad, if I recall, is from Goa?
Yeah, that's why I've got for an Indian background, a surname that's not typically Indian.
Yeah.
Goa, for those of you who don't know, is a former Portuguese colony. So the naming of people there, is more Portuguese, and this was anglicised from a Portuguese name.
Right.
But most of my cousins have names like De Lima and Suarez and Fernandez, which when you hear of someone from India, they're generally from Goa.
Right. Okay, so you were born in Australia, and then what happened? Did you go to high school in Australia, or did you studied abroad, right?
I did. So 0 to 18 was living in a small town and travelling 50 kilometres every day to go to school, which you do in Australia. It's quite a big country. And then graduating, I think just towards the end of high school, honestly, I was looking at these two exchange students. There was one guy from Bolivia and there's this girl from Sweden. I was like, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I want to do that.
Yeah.
So I found out about their program, and it turned out that because I was 18 at the time, that was actually nearing the end of a typical age for a program like this. And there was only one country I could go which would accept an 18-year-old, and that was Costa Rica. And I was like, great, I'm going.
Oh, that's right. You went to Costa Rica.
Yeah.
And you were a bartender in Costa Rica.
No, I was a bookmaker.
Oh, you were a bookmaker. That's right. Okay, this is cool. So you're 18. You're like, hey, I want to go abroad. But Costa Rica is the only country that would take an 18-year-old. So you go there, and did you go there for school?
That was the initial idea, and I was planted with this really sort of interesting, loving, welcoming family. And they had their 3 kids. She was from the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica, and the husband was Venezuelan. and he had a French education, so he wanted them to have a French education. All their money was like sort of focused on getting those kids into the Liceo Franco Costarricense, which is the French school in Costa Rica, and they're like, you go there. And so I go there on day one, bought a blue shirt, and didn't last more than 2 or 3 weeks. Poorly organised, the vice principal didn't know why I was there, speaking to me in French, having a Spanish speaker interpret my English was an insult. So there was an attempt at one point to like get me teaching English and learning French and learning Spanish, but it never worked out. So I was then without a school and running out of money because I think I was enjoying the time as an 18-year-old does. And then I was like, okay, what do I really do? I want to go to university. That cost money. And then a friend who I made at the time said, look, you should go and work with me. We need people who can just speak English to take bets from Americans on sports. And that was the start.
Wait, so you're I guess a bookkeeper is like it's a bookie, right? You're
gambling.
So you're the bookie, and these were all American tourists that you
No, Americans in America, because at the time you can't, or maybe you still can't, gamble on sport unless you're in Vegas or Atlantic City.
Right.
And the preventions are in place to prevent the offshore or interstate gambling.
Right.
So this was like a 1-800 number that was bouncing to Costa Rica that was facilitating gambling on football and college football and baseball and hockey and basketball.
So what exactly were you doing?
Talking to people and taking money. Like the money was in Western, it was in bank accounts, but 100 on this, 10,000 on that.
Right. And so what year is this?
This was just turning into 2000, so it was just as the internet was taking off.
Right.
So it was still a lot of phone calls.
Yeah.
Interestingly, there was a point. This just showed how ignorant I was about the US and how big a country it is, and how much people also come from different parts of what for me was just America.
Yeah.
A week or two in, they sort of pulled me aside and said, "Look, we've been listening to your calls, and we really like what you're doing, but we realise that you just don't know anything about our geography." And I'm like, can you tell me what you mean? And they're like, well, someone will call up and say, oh, what's happening in Wisconsin today? And I'll just kind of fumble through until I worked out that they were looking for the Green Bay Packers, or that they were looking for the Badgers, or that they were looking for Milwaukee Bucks.
Right. And they're thinking they're talking to someone in the US.
Yeah. So they're like, you need to go away, take a geography exam.
Yeah.
And here's like 6 pages of every professional and college team in the country, and they're like, we'll pay you if you can pass the exam and you can stay. So a week later I came back and had that, okay, who did I miss? I think it was the Brewers in Wisconsin.
So you passed the exam?
Passed the exam, could stay, and then that was just an interesting year working and then going to university and living in Costa Rica learning Spanish.
Right. And wow, this is, so you learned all about American sports.
Yeah, I had to. And then, it helped me in life a few times. I was working in a bank and I got offered a job in the markets when the person found out this story and said, can you explain to me how it works? Oh yeah,
that's right. Okay, so your gambling stint in Costa Rica is what led you to go
impress people in terms of, well, that's not too far away from what we do if you can understand how the concepts apply.
So in Costa Rica, you learned Spanish.
Yeah.
Right? And people probably thought you were Costa Rican.
Yeah, until they heard me at the time. I had a pretty bad accent.
Right. And how long were you in Costa Rica?
Just over a year, and then I came back and I travelled a little bit before I went to university. I didn't go to school until I was 21. So I started working in bars and travelling because I had that bug. Yeah. And then eventually I went to university 3 years after high school, which is not traditional. I know a lot of people, they go straight in.
Oh yeah, no, I get it. I same here. I went much later. So then you come back to Australia, you go to university, and then you're like, I need a job.
No, before that I went away again. So I finished my university in Spain. So I continued that whole sort of like traveling around Latin America, trying to really get better at Spanish. And I got a scholarship to finish my university in Spain. And when that all finished, I eventually came back to Australia, but I'd missed all the graduate recruitment.
Right.
So I was lucky enough to get a job, but it wasn't through internships and applying through grad recruitment rounds.
Right.
And honestly, at the time, it was just someone's meeting me actually and saying, look, I think you'd be good at my team, but I don't work in the cool parts of the bank. I work in HR.
Right.
So I said, that's fine. I'll come and if it's a foot in the door, and they said, come and work with us for 18 months, and then you'll get a chance to decide whether you want to stay or not.
Yeah. And this is Citibank.
In Citibank, yeah.
And Citibank in Australia?
in Sydney. By that stage, I was back in Australia.
Yeah. And like, did you like it or?
Yeah, I did. I mean, all in all, it was an invaluable experience. I think people work hard, results orientated. There were times where I think, they saw I was getting bored or impatient, and I was lucky enough to continue getting opportunities for different work. So then within 2 years, I'd moved to Singapore. And then 4 years later, I moved to Japan. And I stayed there for 4 years. So by the end of it, I was there for close to a decade, but I had interesting opportunities along the way.
Yeah. Which is awesome because you got to move around from Australia to Singapore. Were you in Hong Kong or?
Never permanently, but that was always, a part of the job.
Yeah. But Japan, so you were in Japan for quite a while.
Yeah, I just moved there right after the earthquake in 2011, coincidentally. But at that stage, it was an interesting workplace to be, I think. And it was at that point where I was evaluating, look, if I stay longer, I'm just going to be one of these people staying in one corporation. And I'd been thinking about it, like it's just easy to get another job in another place and keep this cycle. It's probably harder to leave, but it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. And then after that, you started a fintech company.
Yeah, but it didn't start it immediately. I came back to Singapore because I felt it was going to be the best place for me to do something where I had to unlearn and start again, leverage networks, look for what it was that really was my mission, my vision around where I wanted to be. And Singapore felt like it was the best place to kind of work that out. But I was lucky in that the first year I could have gone to an MBA school, like a lot of people do, but I thought, look, for me, the MBA of doing is going to be the maybe less traveled by, but a path that I want to take. So I was lucky enough to have this variety of different contracts, and that included setting up an accelerator. It included, working in a hedge fund for a little while. They were looking at fintech projects, just getting experience from people who are still trying to work out what this all is. Right. And ultimately that led to being a co-founder of a startup that was issuing Visa prepaid debit as a non-bank. It was looking at an entry point into payments, basically.
Yeah. And that was called?
It's called Yolopay.
Oh, Yolopay,
and then it changed to Canvas towards the end, just as we were in the process of deciding. We kind of got to a point where we'd launched the product, but we needed money to really scale it.
Yeah.
The business model, there were questions around whether it was going to be viable. It required a lot of acquisition of customer, and you look at then the business model of payments being quite, requiring scale.
Right.
And also at that time, payments was really challenged. Like there was like this big crypto boom, and everyone was asking, why are you doing this when everyone's doing, non-fiat, Bitcoin related products? So we just decided at that point, look, it's best to shut it down. We were lucky enough to sell it, in that there was someone who was interested in some of the assets we developed, and it was a good point to move on.
Did that have some sort of a license that was valuable?
That was part of what we sold. It was an issuing license that we had we were not the issuer, but we had a relationship with the issuer and now it's called Wirecard. People have heard about it. It's in the process of
Wirecard, like the big German payments company.
So Wirecard for a number of years have lent their issuing license to third parties. And we were one of the first to get that issuing license. That was ultimately theirs, but we could use it.
So you bought the license from Wirecard, or you were just
renting it. Like they were offering it, the scheme they called it, to many different people.
Right.
And it just meant that like others who were like in the backlog or wanting to like utilize the scheme were 12 to 24 months of like wait time applications, and so that time was valuable for others.
Yeah. By the way, what exactly happened with Wirecard? Because I've read some articles on, they were fudging their books, et cetera. But do you know really like sort of details of what happened?
I mean, I think that's at the high level. Some maybe management misadventures. I mean, a lot of their business was generated off a small number of clients. Always, I think at a certain point in time, some of that was in the dubious parts of the internet, which for whatever reason got them going. But then afterwards, they'd gotten to a certain scale. I mean, they were acquiring, merchant acquisition businesses, which was a whole different vertical outside the issuing. Yeah. They were doing seemingly well, but it's obvious that there were certain things going on internally that led to this demise.
Right, and they're pretty much shut down now, or
so that
unwinding?
issuing license, or sorry, that issuing book of sorts in the customers associated was, I believe, in the UK acquired by Railsbank, who's a customer of ours in Mission Plus, which we'll come to later.
Right. So with Yolopay, how long were you working on that for?
For a couple of years. Ravi, the original founder, was working for a couple more. I think his challenge at the time was he was trying to do something that now maybe he was ahead of his time.
Yeah.
Now it's like a lot more. The difficulties and challenges of the setup have been sorted out. So he spent his first 2 years really trying to get that infrastructure up to launch, working with parties that were still working it out themselves. So by the time we got to Wirecard, they certainly had the infrastructure. We were just running out of time. I think the technology was challenging to deploy with their systems and with our capabilities, and that's one of the motivating forces for what I'm doing now. That technology can be hard, but doesn't always have to be with the right people.
Right. So when you sold Yolo Canvas, was it a good exit, and who acquired it? Are you allowed to say? Or?
Yeah, of course, it's publicly available. It's Singlife here in Singapore.
Yeah.
They were interested in. I mean, they're a digital insurer. They were interested in sort of moving beyond the realms of traditional insurance.
Yeah.
So they thought one of the ways, when you sell a policy and you have limited interactions with a customer, to sort of like keep that stickiness engagement is to have something like a card. Could they bring that into the relationship? Could they have more options on engagement?
Yeah.
So having an option on just understanding what we were doing to see if they could bring that in was part of the sell for them.
Yeah. And was it a good exit for you?
Hey,
were you popping champagne, or were you?
Well, we were going back to shareholders and saying, look, this is like, after all the effort of starting the business, this is helping us right now, helping you. So let's do what we can.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't like lying on a beach,
Yeah.
Exits, and not all of them are.
Yeah.
But it was a good outcome given where we were.
Yeah. And did you raise external investments for that company?
Yeah, so external investments had gone in over 2 rounds actually. So that was part of what this was about at the end.
Right. So then after Yolopay or Canvas, then you started Mission Plus.
No, in between I went to REAPRA.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So that's where I was looking at, well, what do I want to do next? I mean, you have these inflection points, or in some circumstances, life and where you are, forces that hand.
Yeah.
Obviously we're seeing a longer run on the payments business. It wasn't there.
Right.
But I felt that the option when I was asked to interview at REAPRA was around, well, there's a lot that I knew I did well. There's a lot that I knew I could have done better. There's ongoing rounds of learning. One way to get that is to maybe look at it from an investor side, especially when you think about it. Right, you've been there. You do have that asymmetrical access to, in a very short period of time, a number of business models, a number of different conversations around how founders are looking to start a business.
Yeah.
For me, it was never about questioning or challenging, just trying to understand how they were going to make it work.
Yeah.
And so going in from that perspective, I looked at it as much, what I could help founders in terms of what I did in my experiences, but also learning from others as well.
Yeah. Well, I worked at the same company for a while, and I was. What was your sort of key takeaways or learnings from working there in terms of you come across so many different types of entrepreneurs, founders. And you look at so many different companies and business models, so it's actually very exciting in that sense. Various different geographies, from Vietnam to Thailand to Japan to India. Were there sort of certain insights that you had while working there, which you thought was uniquely different than, say, if you're working at a well-known venture fund in Singapore?
Sure. I think there's some about the differences between the interpretation and then just some about just general observations around what you see. I won't answer your question first because a thought came to mind, but I'll come back to it.
Yeah.
One is that it's amazing how you see over a period of time trends come through the number of business plans or founders so there's a period where it's e-commerce platforms for X, and then suddenly
Right.
you see 5 of those within a space of no period at all, right?
Right.
And I think, and so many times I felt as well, the founders that you could see cutting through, we're looking at it almost from an not existential, but they're looking at it from a different lens or a different like way of, okay, this is how I'm really going to get through, as opposed to just the same conversations you're having about problem solution.
Yeah.
Those that could really tie their understanding of a market, their analysis, looking at it from maybe a segment perspective and looking at the value chain. When you suddenly started having conversations with founders at that level, it's like, okay, this is interesting, but for you to have that, you had to speak to many others who are still working it out.
Yeah.
I think the unfortunate part, before I get to your question, is that people are raising to find the business model. Not everyone comes in knowing what the business model is. But in terms of how REAPRA thought about and looked at it differently, I mean, it goes back to the first statement I made when we were kicking off, that more often Shuhei, who founded the business, was not interested in what you're doing, he was interested in who you are. So him coming in and speaking to a founder who's probably spoken to 10 other investors in the last week or month, and they're like going straight into pitch to me, and Shuhei's asking, tell me about your grandparents. I don't think they knew where to start.
Yeah. It's like, hey, I have good product market fit. Well, tell me about your uncle.
But he had a point. I mean, ultimately he's like, if I get to know a bit about you first, then I'll understand why you're interested in talking to me about the business, right?
Yeah.
But we never really telegraphed it, I think. And so it put people, I guess, at times in a confusing place when they were interacting.
Right.
Though over time, I think people, once they had a few conversations, understood the benefit. The other part as well is I think he was, and the team were working out that they didn't want to work with the traditional model, which was, okay, we know that X number of companies we're going to invest in, of which Y are going to not succeed, and of that, as long as we've got the right numbers in place, we'll ultimately, as a fund, we'll ultimately get there. Instead, it was more, we want to see as many of the portfolio do well.
Yeah.
They don't have to swing the bat for the traction metric. So it was different. Seeing those perspectives in play.
Yeah. I've always been curious because you've lived in Japan, so I think you understand Japanese culture better than a lot of people, including myself. I love Japan. I've spent a little bit of time there, but I've never lived there. And the Japanese culture is so unique and fascinating and amazing, but it just takes so long to really understand it. Do you feel that you've sort of cracked the code, or do you feel it's still very elusive?
Well, I was there for 4 years, and I was working in an American bank, and there were times when I was trying to learn Japanese and not doing it very well. Yeah. So I would say, and during those periods of here, have an interpreter rather than push through. So I would say my unfortunate takeaways were that I didn't spend enough time, understanding, appreciating, learning the culture, the language. My takeaways are always going to be more, I'd guess, from the work context, where I did get to see, interestingly, I mean, I may undervalue the experience, but at least Citi in Japan was 5 very different businesses, and I had the option to go into each of them from time to time as part of my job. So maybe just saying, okay, well, I saw 5 companies because the credit cards business was a very domestic business, and so you'd see people punching in and punching out. Through to the markets, which was bilingual and bicultural, and you could have been in London and everything in between. I wouldn't say I've cracked code, but I've just had observations and learnings.
Well, there's clearly a huge difference between Japanese corporate culture. So if you're working at a Citibank or any of these large corporations in Japan, or international corporations, so there's that corporate culture, but then the entrepreneurial culture, which is sort of where you and I spend time, which is working with people who are very, very different than the corporate folks. But there's still, even that has its own set of rules and its set of culture that it's still uniquely, the way they look at investments is clearly very different than, let's say, how an American fund would look at it.
Sure.
Did you sort of have some, what were your thoughts on that culture which is different than the corporate culture?
Well, I think the corporate culture may imbue the investment culture or the startup culture or the mindset, but I found that maybe that sort of, take risk, like that. Here you are, you've got to like break rules. Here you are, you've got to make decisions quickly. Some of that may be that kind of, that valley mindset of just getting out there and getting there before someone else does. I didn't see that as much, just from the few experience I had on the Japanese side.
Yeah.
So I've always been curious as to how companies are sort of starting up in Japan, because I didn't go back and really look at it, to be honest, that much. But
I was always very curious to go and learn what REAPRA Ventures was doing in Japan, because it was very, very Japanese specific.
Yeah.
All Japanese founders in Japan building things for the Japanese market.
Many of whom are doing well. I think a lot of what they were trying to do was say, look, let's just find a business model that can get to cash flow. Right. Let's find a segment, and again, it's like looking at it from maybe more of a macro level, and say, don't just do what you think is going to, get that platform to scale on day one. Instead, maybe find something that gets you to a cash flow, right? And then build from there, right? So, if they were finding in a domestic market that there was optionality that others weren't uncovering in terms of value in that value chain, I think that's what Shuhei's mindset and the team there was about. Yeah. As opposed to, okay, that may be a boring business, don't do it. Instead, build the platform and try to get X thousand customers and scale, which we see more in our world.
And having spent quite a bit of time sort of really trying to understand people, right? Because that was sort of the model, just like, hey, let's understand the individual, their motivation, and make determination on their ability to succeed based on the individual. Were you able to now sort of have a bit of, can you see some patterns in people behavior and individuals as it relates to their outcomes as a business person?
I think, I've been doing this, with that sort of mindset and methodology since 2017 into 18. So we're talking, 3-ish years.
Right.
So what I'm missing in terms of that is a time frame.
Yeah.
Because we'll know in a few years, whether it's actually playing out, because you need a few cycles, right? Yeah. But I feel that there were aspects that were identified around motivation that I'd never thought about before that were actually quite interesting. It's not just does the person draw an intrinsic motivation to do what they're doing, but it's coupling it with how do they think? Is it coupling it with the number of actions? All the things that we know entrepreneurs need. Yeah. That give me a better sense about maybe the people I want to work with. So if my selection is not so much today for an investor, it's more about who I want to work with in the future.
Right. Fascinating. That in itself, that topic, I know there's been a lot of research done on people traits and sort of going back and looking patterns and the outcomes of personalities. Yeah. But that in itself is such a fascinating topic.
And they're looking at this on a long term, where they want to find enough time spent with enough founders to build that sample, to have a time frame then to calibrate it back. There are other people that I came across through this journey who are doing that as well. In Australia, there's a great company called Fingerprint for Success, and they've looked at a sample similarly of founders back history, SME founders back history, and said, okay, this is what we saw in terms of their personality, and they can now sell for interested parties an option on you taking a test and seeing how you correlate. So there's a lot of people who I think are trying to draw this out, because a lot of people realize it's not just the idea, it's not just the timing, it's the person that's actually at the early stage.
Yeah. And then after that, did you start Mission Plus right after that, or were you working on that simultaneously?
In between. So there was a period, I think, in the middle, and I just said, look, I want to make sure that I can keep myself interested and engaged, and if we're in the business of trying to work with founders, we should also be having those experiences ourselves. Yeah. And so, rather than just being the coach who's just sitting on the sideline, I'm still, in a position where I could play. Right. At the same time, I just wanted to see, I was wanting to extend my motivation into and felt like it was the right time to be a founder again, or to do something that I felt I could lead.
Yeah.
There'd been times in the past where I'd been asked and I didn't feel ready. So this was a good opportunity. Again, where I made the comment before, I didn't want to like take people's money and try and find out the business model.
Yeah.
I wanted to take a different approach where I could test without really spending a lot of money. We were lucky enough then that REAPRA, Priscilla, who Shuhei, were in a place where they said, you can do this, go ahead, still do your job, but spend time.
Yeah.
And so I guess there was a little bit less pressure because I had the security net or the safety of knowing that it wasn't me taking risk on family and rent and savings. So the first year we just worked with a couple of clients and we honestly just went very slowly.
Yeah.
And that was, to your question, all happening whilst I was at REAPRA.
Yeah. And so what is Mission Plus and what do you guys want to do with the company?
So the technical advisor, Ned, who you've met, he's spent his whole entire career and most of his life around technology and code. And someone that people feel quite comfortable with when he's talking about as an advisor or as a support to a person or a company, giving them inputs around their technology stack. Right. He'd been wanting to externally kind of advise and help other people. He's a full-time CTO. Yeah. I'd been speaking to him about this because in Singapore, where we both are, the challenges of every other founder or every other company that I meet, where there's breadth of talent but there's no depth. There's a shortage on labour and skill sets and expertise. A lot of companies then stifle because they can't find the right people. I was lucky enough to be going to places like Vietnam frequently and noticing it was the exact opposite. You had a lot of talented people, right, who had the breadth and the depth. And it was just a case of, well, hold on, we can bring these people into projects that we know need it here in Singapore. Right. So that was just the starting point. It was nothing more than we can help people build better technology with access to the right people, whether it was at the execution level or just the advisory, people around Ned who could architect and give feedback in terms of how to build better roadmaps. Right. And for me, as you know, I'm not a technologist, but it was more the operations and just making sure that things could run accordingly. Right. And that was our first year. But once we got to a point where we had retained earnings, we were getting a lot more inbound inquiry than what we could deal with, because we were getting up every morning, every night. We're sort of doing it on either end. That was when it was time to say, okay, well, I can't juggle all these balls. Right. So the time where I help you with Draper Startup House was that has to continue. The time with REAPRA, which was taking a lot of time, that was a good opportunity to move on. Yeah. And so the Mission Plus, it seems like you're sort of in between a dev shop and a founder or a company where you sort of help facilitate and converting the language of code to the strategic needs of a company, right? Is that? Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, we've been open in this first year to trying different solutions based upon a lot of the different requirements of the clients. In some cases, it's been, I'd say, having a client that says, look, we've already got an existing tech team. We just need more people to service this engine. Yeah. And you know how to sort of navigate other markets to find them and bring them into our team and to support them so they can support us. So there's a lot less strategy there. It's just more the staffing and making sure the right people for the right project. But then as soon as we do that, we have another customer say, look, we need you to help us with a lot more of the end-to-end. Yeah. We need you to help us even with things like business model, especially at early stage where they're still trying to work out their own product market fit. We spend a lot more time telling people not to build, which is not great for the business, but we don't want to take a project where we're just executing, out a software solution that we know is not going to see light of day, or that's ultimately not going to meet the solutions of what they're hoping customers will love. Right. So we do a lot of different things, around rapid prototyping. We do a lot more things around, validation before we build. Mostly at this stage, it's been in fintech, just because of the experiences that we've had. But we have a few other projects that are not in that sector.
Yeah. And you've worked on some interesting projects, right? Already.
Yeah, things that really excite and motivate us. Our first client came from the UK. They're called Railsbank, and I think we're going to hear more about them in the coming years. But they've been a part of this wave of open banking, where they're more or less providing the pipes or the infrastructure from banks and giving that option on non-banks to do everything from issuing cards to servicing certain parts of the consumer and non-consumer financial needs.
What exactly is open banking?
So open banking, there's a few different types of definitions now. There's definitions like embedded finance, or where, for example, where banks were good for being at a point in time a brick and mortar that you'd go to get your mortgage. I need a loan. You'd literally have to turn to the bank to get the loan. You may have been on Carousel trying to buy something, right? And you say, okay, well, I can't buy this because I don't have the money. So let me go and see if I can get a loan.
Right.
That would have been what we did a few years ago. It may not have been at Carousel, but I use Carousel as the example because right now you could be on Carousel, and embedded finance is where the option pops up in your customer journey and says, oh, you're looking for a loan. There are people out there now that are doing that. That's an example of like an embedded finance where it's thinking less about the business model, more about the customer journey. So there's a lot of different solutioning right now that's taking place that is looking about bringing finance into our lives.
Gotcha. So it's essentially, if you were, for instance, a real estate search platform looking to buy a house, you could potentially have mortgages behind there. You could essentially service the entire flow of that transaction, and that's open banking.
Well, open banking can come in many different manifestations. There's so many different use cases now that are evolving. That could be a topic for another day. But Railsbank is a form of banking as a service. So that's another thing that they call themselves, because they're saying, look, we, rather than being the one source of banking, which is traditionally the bricks and mortar, they're providing that to many other players who can then embed that into their company sort of propositions. So they're working with a lot of different companies right now, where those companies have other core propositions, but they're helping bring the pipes of banking into what they're doing.
That's amazing. I think that's really the future, right? And then what other?
We've been providing some technology for that team as they kind of expanded to Asia. And there's just been other sort of similar projects.
It seems like fintech is sort of like where your core competency kind of lies as Mission Plus as a company, right?
It's where we have, I'd say, most of our strengths. If you speak to a lot of other places, they'll say, look, we can build an e-commerce platform. We can build an ed tech. When people speak to us, sure, we could build something in that area, but what people like about our engagement is that we understand a lot about what they're doing, so that their path, when they choose to use us, they know it's going to be straight up.
On your website, I also saw Revolut. Are you open to talk about what you're doing for them?
So it's advisory on some of their banking APIs as they were coming out to Asia, or some of their integrations that they were using, because even though they're a payment solution that comes across as very standalone, they still have to integrate with some of the banks in the back end. So just having experiences in that domain allowed us to kind of help them short track their sort of market entry.
So Mission Plus is now what, 2 years old, 3 years old?
It's actually entering into its second year now.
So it's still super early. And what has that journey been like? Starting it, trying to get clients, and you're still super early. Has it been a good journey so far?
Yeah, it has been. I would say it's been made a lot less a lot more stress-free, though we have the challenges, because we didn't stop and say, let's quit our jobs. I would say that hedging that aspect helped us somewhat. It gave us a bit more flexibility to try different things. And one thing we didn't do is we didn't overcommit on day one in terms of team hiring, any costs that could be variable,
Right.
we decided not to fix, so that as we sort of grew, we could just be very nimble.
Yeah.
So that helped, I think, significantly. But I'd say right now we're moving from just that project to business stage. In this next year, we now have a sales team, which we didn't have before.
Right.
Like we were previously relying on referrals,
Right.
and that was great because there was enough of that to come in to help us sort of just achieve the month-on-month growth.
Right.
But now having a sales team means that we can be a better position to target sort of the companies we want to work with.
Yeah. And do you have some sort of vision for where you want to take Mission Plus, say, in 5 years from now?
We do. I mean, what we're doing right now is we're saying, look, we just grow organically. We want to make sure that we, sort of use retained earnings to sort of build, a better team, to work with more people. I think at the same time, we want to excite the people who are working with us to try different things themselves. So each of the people we've had working with us has had an option on taking time to build, something themselves or to play with their own idea.
Yeah.
Because we're testing and ideating for so many clients, we're also open for our employees to do the same.
Yeah. Do you think, having worked on the investor side and seen so many companies sort of pitch, do you think that's helped you the way you are trying to build Mission Plus?
Yeah.
The way you're because it sounds like you're thinking about it from a very much like cash flow, retained earnings, build it slowly, right?
It is and it isn't. I mean, because if I followed the model of what I was seeing on an investor side,
Right.
I would know that there's actually capital that I could take to build something quite quickly, to then go to a next round of funding, because I've seen how that path works and know how to set up for that journey. That's just at the same time littered with risks that I didn't want to take, because I also know that for every company that goes through that path successfully, there's others who don't.
Yeah.
So I just was in a position where I wanted to be a little slower to get to where I wanted to be.
Yeah.
So yes, I think it did, but it didn't influence me to go in the way that most would.
Yeah.
So if anything, it was just more exercising restraint. Times we could have taken risk.
Yeah.
Still test and experiment. Like all of the experiments we've done so far are really low cost. We've actually invested in a couple of companies where we get access to a lot of insights and learning.
Yeah.
We think, okay, if that can be a template for what we want to do, we can then, use that opportunity to maybe build out some IP.
Yeah.
So when you ask about where you want to be in 5 years, it's not just solely building for others, but it could be building our own.
Yeah.
But taking time to get there without having to worry about,
Yeah.
fundraising to do it.
Yeah. The Mission Plus is not an outsourcing company. I mean, I wouldn't say you're like a dev shop where people go if they need technology. I think you're more than that. But what's been your view of how outsourcing has evolved over time? So it started off, let's say, year 2000. Hey, we need to fix bugs in the zeros and on the computer. Let's send it to India, right? That's how sort of like outsourcing started.
Yeah.
But then India became a very expensive place, and there were some language barriers, and then it moved to sort of Philippines, and there's a lot of dev shops in Vietnam. So there's been there's evolution of the outsourcing of technology. Where do we stand today in terms of which countries are the key players? Where is a good place to find good talent? Is it Costa Rica? Is it but it's like really gone global. Is it Ukraine? Is it
Sure. Well, I think a lot of people use these different words around outsourcing that I've learned, because you could technically use a market in Latin America, but if you're from the Asia time zone, it's going to be really challenging.
Right.
So I hear a lot in the UK about near sourcing, where it's actually close to home.
Right.
So they look at time zone as a specific requirement, so Eastern Europe becomes an option. But that said, I mean, if the options there are not meeting because of cost or because of the type of skill sets, I mean, then Asia is, the next frontier or available option. And we've been lucky because I wouldn't say that we're riding that wave of people coming from Europe needing us. It's more that they're coming to Asia and needing us. So that we're servicing when they set up in Singapore and they're looking at their Asia market as a new source market.
Right.
When you look at all the different markets, I mean, for us, the reason why we decided to start with Vietnam was because Ned will talk about it at length, but he looks at this exceptional talent. He looks at and he goes back into detail about the communist sort of like Russian background of education and how it teaches a certain mindset, and that, you know, that technically the proficiencies are, you know, at levels that he doesn't see in many other locations. And he's, you know, tested and tried almost all the markets across the region. That said, you know, it becomes a hot market. You've got to look at alternatives for different solutions as well. And a lot of people we know are leveraging individuals in Indonesia, you know, and obviously Philippines and India. It comes down ultimately to preferences around, you know, culture, around cost, around language. Not just talking technically, but from a communication standpoint that you need to consider. We do find, honestly, that one of the things we have to augment or make sure we cover from Vietnam, just as an example, is that English is still developing. We work on other projects with people from Philippines, and, you know, everyone communicates just as effectively as we do. Right? So, you know, you have different challenges with every market.
Yeah. Do you so you're saying that the proficiency of talent in terms of really building products might be stronger in Vietnam, but there is a language barrier. Whereas Philippines, the language is seamless, but maybe the quality of output may not be the same.
Well, we haven't used people from Philippines for technical projects, but we've been using them for like the next stage when we're like looking at, for example, providing a customer service, you know, where there has to be online, always on, you know. So we just made those decisions. But yeah, I think everyone, to your question, if they were assessing just say a technical output resource candidate from a different country, they'd have to make all these considerations. And everyone has different experiences, I guess, over time as well. But when you asked about the evolution, obviously it comes from there being at some point in time a shortage of people to service, you know, all the demand that happens in places like the US, where they firstly found India, and you've got 1 billion people, right? And they're all sort of, you know, there's a lot of people who are trained, have competencies that they can plug in. And, you know, you talk about rise and fall. I mean, I think I missed a lot of that because I've only been sort of more recently, you know, part of the whole industry. But I mean, for us, we notice here in Singapore acutely that it comes down to lack of option. It comes down to cost. I mean, everyone here wants to work at Google, wants to work at Goldman's, wants to work at Facebook. A lot of startups can't access talent on demand.
Right.
And so there is a market in this globalized workplace, you know, that for augmenting those people into great jobs. And lastly, I just add on that I think we are all becoming more distributed by default. And what I mean by that is, I just realised we're going over, which is okay. I've got a phone call, but that I think, you know, when we're like looking to work with people now, we don't even put locations. So we're happy, you know, to look at someone if they're in New Zealand or India, which is on the edges of our time zones, for jobs now. So we keep quite an open mind.
All right, I know you have to run.
Sorry,
so one last question that I ask everybody. If you had to go back to your 17-year-old self in Costa Rica, what advice would you give yourself?
Stay a little longer. I jumped on a flight and came back over a year later, but I would have loved to have seen where that could have gone. I think the pressures of going to school and, you know, doing all of that came to mind, but I wish I would have just not been so caught up.
You know, that seems to be the pattern of answers that I'm getting from everybody is take it slow, enjoy a bit more, don't rush it. And that's sort of like what you were saying is you should, you know, stayed in Costa Rica. Costa Rica's changed a lot since then, I'm sure.
I've heard it's changed significantly.
All right, Nick, thank you.
Thank you.
If you need technology services, you know where to find Nick. We'll put his stuff on the video. But yeah, Mission Plus.
Thank you very much.
Wishing you lots of success.
All the best.
Right.
Thanks,
Thank
Vikram.
you.